very sorry. I'm still seeing glitches here. I don't know why this is happening. I don't know whether it's an internet issue.
We can see it clearly. We
You
can see the
can.
screen. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, and it's disappeared.
So sorry.
We can just work around it, and if you just like to talk to your slides, and it's reappearing by the looks of it.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, probably now is a good time to hit record. Very, very sorry, everyone. So as Natalie said, my name is Hilary Agg. I work with Unseen UK. We are a national charity, but we are based in Bristol. I've got two roles within the organisation. So one is very outward facing. I coordinate the Southwest Anti-Slavery Partnership, which includes the Avon and Somerset Anti-Slavery Partnership Board as well. And then I'm also head of policy and research for Unseen. So a lot of that work centres around the lived experience panel that we hold. So we've got 13 people who are survivors of modern slavery working with us. And that's all about facilitating survivor voice into modern slavery research, advocacy, and informing our operations as well. But Unseen does do a lot of other things at the same time. So we work directly with survivors of modern slavery through the UK Victim Care Contract. We run 2 safe houses in the southwest area, but we also provide outreach support as well to survivors who are living in the community. So when a person is referred for support through the national referral mechanism, they may be dispersed to services such as Unseen services here in the Southwest. We also assist businesses to identify and address risk within their supply chains. I mention this because we are increasingly doing this for public sector bodies as well. You may have seen over the last couple of years, or indeed been working on cases which mean that the supply chains of our councils are by no means immune to commissioning goods and services that have modern slavery in the supply chain. And we're seeing such a huge problem and an ongoing problem with people being exploited within the care sector and in health settings as well. The final thing I'll mention here is that we run the National Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline, and that is the UK-wide helpline for anyone who's got concerns about modern slavery, and certainly it's for survivors to call and request assistance as well. I'll have a slide up on the helpline at the end because it's a really key resource for everyone to be aware of. So if it's okay, I'm going to start with a video, which is a first-hand account of a woman who I know very well, and she's called Tanya. It does come with a bit of a health warning, though. Some of the things that she relays about her experience of exploitation, they are really distressing. It does go into some detail about the violence that she was subject to. So by all means, if you're not in the frame of mind for this today, then you can mute or turn your the screen for a moment beforehand. I'm just thinking, I'm hoping it's going to share with audio at this point. Let me know if not. So Tanya's experience is very similar to hundreds of thousands of people who are trafficked to be exploited here in the UK. Such a huge human cost in every single situation that we see. But this is just one MO of modern slavery, and it includes just one form, so labour exploitation. And I'll be talking about the other forms just in a few moments. But if we look back at what happened to Tanya, she was tricked into coming into this country over 20 years ago. Modern slavery, it's not a new crime. It's been happening for decades, but it only became a formal offence back in 2015. And really, despite that legislation, we're still not doing enough to stop modern slavery from happening. So while she was looking for a job in her country, she heard that it was possible to find work in the UK and start a new life here. As far as she knew, this was a completely legitimate thing to do. She had this real passion for history and she just wanted to get set up here and become an archaeology student. So she sold her flat, she paid an agent everything that she had and took a bus across Europe, arriving in the UK in Victoria Coach Station. On arrival, she met a man who she'd been told to find, and he asked for her passport, saying that he just needed to show his solicitor so that the solicitor could arrange her work permit. So if we try and put ourselves in Tanya's shoes in this situation, she just found herself in a new country. She had no English. She's a young woman, and she'd just given up everything she had for this new direction in life. So she did what he said. She went with him, and when they arrived at the house, she was told that she owed another £10,000 for her travel and that she had to work it off and that she'd be paid only 30 pence a day. She was put to work in agriculture. She was doing fruit and vegetable picking, and she was doing that from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. every single night. And they took her and the other people that she was working with to greenhouses in the evenings once it got too dark to be working in the fields. She was made to work through all weathers, wearing over only a light top and some flip-flops. She wasn't allowed to speak to others around her. And when anyone violated the rules, there were really strict, violent punishments as examples to others, as you heard in her testimony there. She was told that if she tried to leave or to seek help, then she would be reported to the authorities and put in prison for 15 years for immigration violations, which at the time just wasn't true, because she had a right to work in the UK. But increasingly, we're seeing really harsh immigration rules that now mean that she might have been detained if this had happened to her now. They were being continuously transported around, and she had absolutely no idea where she was or even how long she'd been in this situation. But we do know that it was after several years after witnessing her exploiters assault that young lad. She decided that essentially she couldn't take it anymore, and she decided that she'd rather die than continue in this situation. So she confronted them. They took her to a field, they locked her in this derelict caravan, and they just abandoned her there. So, what is modern slavery? This is a pervasive, under-recognised, under-prosecuted, extremely high harm crime, and unfortunately victims are finding it increasingly hard to access support because of some legislative changes. Many people, they don't know just how common modern slavery is in the UK. It's in almost every sector, it's in all communities, and once you know what to look out for, unfortunately, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. Traffickers, they place such a high level of control over their victims that very few are able to seek help out of exploitation. And most are so terrified of the repercussions from their exploiters that they won't feel able to disclose even when they are recognised by agencies, authorities, and so they go unreported. Traffickers at this point are essentially working with impunity. Most cases do not get to prosecution. The stats that I always trot out for this is that between 2017, 2019, there were 64 adult offenders sentenced for modern slavery offences, but nearly 23,000 victims identified within that same time frame. Victims, they are, like all of us, a very diverse group of people, and their experiences are completely unique to them. But we do know, and we have seen, that many people are left traumatized for life as a result of their exploitation. And certainly many people do struggle to build a life if they do leave these situations. Many of them, they are left with long-term injuries and conditions as a result of their exploitation. And as I've referenced, there's been a real swathe of legislative change that has made it harder for victims and survivors to get support, but also for us as professionals to be responding to the crime. And a final point on this slide. So the placard is slightly misleading. Most people aren't rescued. They often leave of their own volition, or they're abandoned, as Tanya was, because they had either ceased to be profitable to their exploiters or because they'd become a liability to their exploiters. So in the UK, there's an estimated 130,000 people living in a situation of modern slavery. And what we're seeing is this year-on-year increase in the number of people who are identified as potential victims and who accept support into what's called the National Referral Mechanism. In 2025, we saw over 23,000 people referred for support. What this tells us is that we are getting better at identifying people and facilitating that entry into support, but we're still really far short of that 130,000 people that we need to identify and facilitate out of exploitation. So modern slavery essentially is an umbrella term. It's defined by the 2015 Modern Slavery Act, and it encompasses the crimes of slavery, servitude, forced labour, and then human trafficking. Someone can be said to be in a situation of modern slavery if they are forced to work, if they are owned or controlled by their employer, if they're treated as a commodity being bought and sold, or if they have restrictions made on their freedom. So as you can see, that is a really broad range of people and a really broad range of experiences that are falling under this umbrella legal term. Human trafficking is a form of modern slavery, and it's a form that involves transport of some kind. It is the movement of people for the purposes of exploiting them. This movement, it does not need to be over a national border. It can be between towns, between cities, and some of the cases that we've worked on, we've been able to get prosecutions for people who were moving someone from one house down the street to another house on the same road. Human trafficking, it is different to people smuggling, very important. So people smuggling is the illegal movement of a person across a national border without that form of exploitation once a person is in a country. Another really important distinction to make is that people smuggling is a crime against the state, whereas human trafficking is a crime against the individuals, the survivors who are at the center of this. And what we see is that often many people who are trafficked into this country, they're arriving by legal means with a visa to work. And it's only once they arrive that they're then trapped into a form of employment which is exploitative in some way. So what does this actually look like? So there are 5 recognized categories of exploitation within the UK. Forced labour or labour exploitation is any work or services that a person is forced to do against their will under the threat of some form of punishment. And we see it in almost all sectors across the UK. Whilst there are businesses that will directly recruit and trap people into working for them, many victims, they are often placed in legitimate businesses which are either unaware or perhaps turning a little bit of a blind eye to their staff being controlled by a third party. Then we see people trapped into really impossible situations, forced to commit crimes for the profit of criminal gangs. We see this in cannabis cultivation, in forced begging in town centres, forced theft, and county lines drug dealing as well. I'm sure you're all aware of that is a modern slavery offence. With sexual exploitation, we see adults and children being forced into prostitution in places like high street massage parlours, in hotels, in pop-up brothels, in salubrious Airbnbs right across the country, so in both urban centres, but also in those more rural places, small sort of tourist villages that no one would expect to see it happening. And then we see women, men, children being continuously transported to perform sexual services in residential locations right across the whole of the UK as well. Domestic servitude is probably the most challenging form of exploitation to identify because it occurs behind closed doors in private homes that look like every other house on the street. And with this form of exploitation, whereas with the other forms, they often involve several people being exploited at one time, with domestic servitude, it often involves just one person being exploited by either a family or an individual. They're forced to perform everyday household tasks, often the childcare as well. They might be referred to as a family member, and often they're rarely allowed to leave the house as well. And you might have seen several cases of this in the news over the last few years. Certainly, Sir Mo Farah came forward to talk about his experiences of domestic servitude in the UK. And then finally, we've got organ harvesting. So this is where traffickers either force or deceive someone into giving up an organ, usually for the purposes of transplantation. There's been very few cases detected within the UK, occurring within the UK, but I would say that this is increasing. And we're also seeing now reports through the helpline of forced surrogacy. So someone being forced to carry a child to term and then that child being taken away from them for another family or individual. These are some of the places that victims have been identified to be exploited in. In the last few years, you might have been hearing about this exploitation happening in car washes and nail bars. Right now, the focus is on the care sector still, on cannabis factories and in construction as well. We're increasingly seeing it in hospitality, takeaways, but also things such as delivery drivers, or rather, I should say, food delivery couriers. But I will say that we tend to find modern slavery where we look for it, where resource is being allocated to address certain sectors, and where staff have been trained to look for it in certain places. It is likely occurring in most sectors, in all geographical locations. It is easier for it to be occurring in sectors with low regulation, with those multi-layered supply chains, and also in those where there's restrictive visa requirements. So the seasonal worker scheme, the overseas domestic worker visa, and then more recently, the health and social care visa as well. But as you can see, it does affect a really wide range of business settings, and it could be happening anywhere. So this is the data from the Home Office for those victims who were identified in 2025 and who accepted support. It does change year to year. Traffickers, they tend to be very dynamic criminals who will exploit any gap, any opportunity, where authorities are becoming alive to certain demographics being exploited in certain ways. They might change up their operation to avoid detection. But you will see that UK nationals are the most often referred victim nationality. And this is a really big point to underscore. Modern slavery is not something that only affects foreign nationals. The caveat here is that we do see a high prevalence of referrals for UK nationals because of the high prevalence of exploitation of UK minors for either criminal or sexual exploitation. Children, they don't need to provide their consent in order to be referred into this system, so they do feature more heavily in the data. But that is by no means to say that UK adults are not exploited. They are exploited in many different sectors and forms of modern slavery, and that's certainly something for us to be alert to. So how do we identify modern slavery? We find it useful to break this down into vulnerability, methods of control, and then indicators. When it comes to how someone finds themselves in this situation in the first place, it's really important to emphasize that modern slavery really can happen to anyone. It happens to men, to women, to children, to everyone from all walks of life. But it certainly does happen more to people who've got higher vulnerabilities, be that internal or external vulnerabilities. We see homeless populations who are often being targeted, young people, those who've had an unstable start to life, people with addictions, people who've been displaced by things like conflict, climate breakdown is something we're seeing increasingly, poverty, social estrangement. These are all things that are going to make someone more attractive to traffickers to target. But that said, the traffickers, they will they'll look for any hook that they can identify. So they will offer to provide something that they know a person wants, and then they'll trap them into that exploitative situation. So an example there is that men are able to convince women that they're in love. They might suggest a romantic trip to London, and then once they arrive, they will force them into prostitution. Once they're in that situation, traffickers, they're going to use a range of approaches to prevent someone from leaving. So if we think about Tanya, she immediately had her travel documents confiscated, so she was unable to return to her country. And she was also told that she would be arrested for those immigration offences if she sought help from the authorities. We saw how she was forced to watch whilst there was physical violence perpetrated against the people around her. And she was also being accommodated only with other people in the same situation as her, and had almost no contact with anyone outside of that. And her exploiters were always present. But I would say that is by no means the case for, I'd say probably the majority of people who are affected by exploitation. Often they are coming into contact with various people within their community or their workplace. Debt bondage is just such a huge problem. Lots of people are being lured into exploitative situations with the promise of work, a better life. With the health and social care visa scheme, we're seeing people paying sometimes over 12,000 up to £80,000 to travel to the UK and to work here. They'll often sell their homes or borrow money to pay this fee. And then once they're here, they'll be told that they owe more money for accommodation, for food, for travel to work. These additional fees, they'll be hugely inflated and deducted from their wage. And that wage is going to get smaller and smaller, and their debts are just going to grow exponentially. If they complain, they might be denied shifts and unable to pay off their debts. And so they'll be continuing to work in the same conditions, hoping that the situation somehow is going to improve for them. So we often get asked, why don't people just leave? So I think some of these have already been touched on in the previous slides, but there are a few more to consider here. So victims, they're often going to have things that perhaps we wouldn't anticipate. So they might have a mobile phone. Like I said, they'll be coming into contact with people out in the world. They're not able to reach out in those circumstances because of all the hidden control methods that are barriers to them being able to say yes if people do recognize them as a victim of modern slavery. A lot of survivors, they report they had absolutely no idea that the authorities in this country would help them or be interested in helping them. They often come from societies where law enforcement are corrupt, and they just express so much regret that they did not reach out sooner in order to access support. Many of them as well, especially those who've experienced sexual exploitation, feel overwhelming shame for what has happened to them. And they might know that if they return home, then they're going to be shunned by their family, perhaps their community. And so they feel unable to leave their exploiter as a result. And finally, on this page, we know that traffickers will threaten the families of their victims and that these threats are real. They will follow through on them. And this is why we shouldn't be expecting victims or survivors to be what's termed the sympathetic victim. They might be presenting as antagonistic, as standoffish, or even aggressive towards strangers and certainly towards authorities as well. So that's really something for us all to be keeping in mind. So these are the categories of indicators that we generally identify. I do encourage you to go away and have a look at our website because we go into these in more detail per exploitation type as well. But I'll just quickly go through them now. Oh dear, I didn't realize I put this in there. So their exploitation, it might be showing on their physical appearance. So they might be appearing unkempt, uncared for. They might have unexplained, untreated injuries. They might be living in very unsanitary conditions with limited access to bathing. And so that's going to have an impact on their physical presentation. But I would as well say that on the flip side of that, they might be very well clothed, they might be presenting as healthy, but other indicators are going to be the ones that are going to suggest that everything isn't okay. Again, this is going to vary from person to person. Some people might be presenting, like I said, that sympathetic victim, very willing to trust you, be very supplicant and asking for help. In other circumstances, their trauma might be presenting as aggression, being standoffish, because they're just so terrified of the repercussions. If you realize what's going on for them, they might even try and protect their exploiter, mislead you about their circumstances. Certainly, they might have behaviors such as avoiding eye contact, being very withdrawn, very nervous. Trauma as well, it results in memory issues, and a lot of people struggle to provide a consistent account of where they've been, what has happened to them, which does lead some professionals to think that they're untrustworthy or they're making up what has happened to them. So some victims will have very limited access to resource and any personal items, but as I said, I've worked with people who were provided with a mobile phone and had a degree of independence but they were under so much coercion that they just couldn't imagine using that phone to ask for help. But that's not going to be the case for everyone. So many people will have had much or all of their paycheck taken from them, and they might only have one set of clothes, and they might not have the common items that you'd expect. They might not have access to their ID documents, and they might not have access to funds or the bank account that their wage is being paid into. This for me is the really big one, the one that you're going to be able to see potentially that distinguishes this from other situations, modern slavery from other forms of abuse. So there are many other subtle indicators that are going to suggest that someone is under the control of another person, but these are just a few to consider. So first of all, obviously, is the physical presence of someone. Perhaps they're masquerading as a friend, a parent, a translator. Perhaps they are presenting with a very similar story to other people that you've encountered, and potentially a story that sounds manufactured. They might have been told to recite this when they're talking to professionals, and shouldn't, again, be taken as a sign of bad faith behaviour. They're likely as well to be very fearful of authorities, fearful that if they are identified, they'll suffer repercussions from their exploiter, or they might have again been told falsely that they would be detained by authorities as a control method. They may be unreliable. They might be unable to keep appointments because they're being controlled by a third party. You may have as well several people attending appointments at a similar time because they're being dropped off, picked up by the same controller. And similarly, multiple people using one bank account is a very big red flag as well. They might rarely be able to leave their house or to or work, and they might be unable to interact with others. They might appear unfamiliar with UK systems, with the processes that we're all completely familiar with, and that might be true even if they've been in the UK for some time. They might not recognise their surroundings, their neighbourhood, and they might not know very basic personal details such as their address. I've already mentioned that they might not have access to suitable sanitation. We see this a lot in houses of multiple occupancy where people are being squeezed into a single room or a caravan. They might be living where they work, and they might be paying really hugely inflated rents for these poor conditions as well. Finally, the restricted movement. So rarely allowed to travel alone, being picked up, dropped off, often with other people. And the other items here we've already really discussed. These also can all mean that they're not able to move around freely as well. I'm rushing because we need to get to this bit, which is responding to modern slavery. So there is support available for victims and survivors of modern slavery, and there's a range of duties on various statutory agencies as well. In terms of the support that's available for people who are identified and who accept that support, it's the National Referral Mechanism, which is the UK's framework for identifying victims of modern slavery and entering them into support. It's also the means by which we monitor the prevalence of modern slavery in the UK. And this is really important because we have to be able to demonstrate the scale of the issue to be able to advocate for increased resource to identify it. Really critically, for adult victims to be entered into the NRM, they must provide informed consent. Where they don't provide that consent, then what's termed modern slavery first responder agencies have a duty to notify the Home Office about the circumstances that they've observed. Unlike any other crime in the UK, in order for a victim to access support, the Home Office must review their case and make a decision about whether they believe that victim's account. If the Home Office deems that they think there are reasonable grounds to believe that that person is a victim, then they're entitled to 30 days of recovery period supports with organisations such as my own, Unseen. And then after that, the Home Office will make a final decision, what's termed a conclusive grounds decision. And If that's positive, then they'll be deemed a victim recognised by the UK, and they'll get an additional 45 days of support and then ongoing needs-based support as well. The main message here is that this is not a permanent resolution. The idea is that they receive the support that they require in order to start their recovery process. So I've mentioned first responders. These are the UK modern slavery first responder agencies. So if you are a staff member for one of these agencies, that means that you are a first responder. And that means that you have a positive duty to consider whether anyone you meet is showing any signs of being a victim of modern slavery. If they are showing signs, then it means that you've got a duty to gather information about the situation. You've got a duty to inform them about their support options through the national referral mechanism. And then you've got a duty, if they give their consent, to be referred in, to make that referral via an online portal. If they don't give their consent, then you've got a duty to notify the Home Office of your concerns that you've witnessed and all of the circumstances around it. I've put in here that it doesn't include healthcare or education, and that's important because if you're a first responder agency and you're contacted by a non-first responder organisation to notify you about concerns about modern slavery, that is when your duty kicks in. So you don't have to be the identifying agency as a first responder for these duties to be incumbent upon your organisation. So this is the UK National Helpline. There's a typo in it. It's because it's no longer a 24-hour service, but it is open 7 days a week from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. It's independent, it's confidential, or it's anonymous if the caller does not want to give any identifying details. And we've got translators ready to go at the end of the line as well. It's open to everyone. Anyone can call. You can call it as a member of the public to report a situation, and if it's appropriate, then we can refer the situation on to the most relevant agency. It's a fantastic tool for professionals because you can sit down with someone who you're concerned about, especially if you need translation, and be with them whilst they call the helpline if they're comfortable with that, so that the helpline can explain to them what their support options are. And then, of course, it's really a bit of a lifeline for many people who are experiencing exploitation or who've experienced exploitation historically. They're able to build trust with the helpline where perhaps that trust is not there with other statutory agencies. They can call anonymously if they want to, and then they can, with time, decide to if they're ready to ask for support and intervention so that they can exit exploitation, but all importantly they can do that at a time which they know to be safest, and we can do some safety exit planning with them. So in terms of next steps, there is full training available. I know it's a lot of information, especially if you haven't been familiar with modern slavery previously. So if you are interested to learn more, by all means, I'll put my email in the chat. I'm very happy to hear from anyone who wants to learn some more. Please do raise this issue amongst your teams, have these conversations with your wider organisation. So understanding things such as what are your internal escalation routes for modern slavery? Is there someone who has a designated role within your organisation that can provide advice, guidance, and continue upskilling staff on modern slavery? Do, like I said, advocate for ongoing modern slavery training. There will be new staff joining all the time, and they could be out there spotting the signs, referring people support. I really encourage you to advocate for internal recording of suspected modern slavery incidents, and then also really clear instructions and reporting to law enforcement about suspected modern slavery as well. I say this because, again, it's really important that we're able to demonstrate the demand around modern slavery so that we can adequately resource it. I'd also really recommend that if you're likely to be coming across modern slavery on a semi-regular basis through your role, that you start to build up contacts within partner organisations, so that you can go to them to trigger multi-agency responses for modern slavery, because certainly it does require everyone to be working cohesively with this collectively, because there's so many different aspects to modern slavery that we really do need all of the tools around the table, all of those skill sets, and also all of the powers as well. I'm very happy to share any resources that anyone wants more information for. And then, of course, please do use and please do share the Modern Slavery Helpline number as well. And I think I've just made time, so I'll stop there.